Good evening, and welcome to this interview with Dr. John Kendle.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Kendle is a professor of history at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada, and he is the author of several books. He is most widely known for his study of the Round Table movement. What other books have you written?
The book you mentioned first is called The Round Table Movement and Imperial Union, which came out in 1975. Some of my other interests include 20th century Ireland and the history of federalism in Britain.
Let's talk about your book on the Round Table movement.
Certainly.
The Round Table is a pretty obscure topic for most people, including professional historians. People automatically associate it with King Arthur and Camelot instead of real British political movement.
Yes, that's true.
So, how did you become interested in the subject?
It was when I was a graduate student at the University of Manitoba. My graduate advisor, a historian by the name of Professor Kendle, had been a member of the movement in Canada in the 1920s. There were no scholarly works done on the Round Table, and he thought research on my part would be a salutary exercise for a young graduate student like myself.
So it was a former Round Table member who introduced you to the subject.
Yes, that's true.
Tell me about your research.
I believe I spent about 12 years doing research, which involved travelling to England to go through the Round Table archives at Oxford University, as well as archives in Canada, such as Toronto.
The present-day Round Table helped you as well.
Yes, of course.
Before you came out with the Round Table movement and Imperial Union, what else had been written about the Round Table?
Not much. There was the book by Dr. Walter Knox, which discussed Milner's Kindergarten, the precursor to the Round Table. There was also a book called Tragedy and Hope, which was written by Carol Quigley, a professor at Georgetown University.
What did you think of those works?
Well, the study of Milner's Kindergarten was excellent and well-researched. Its only drawback was that its narrative ended just when the Round Table movement began. He did touch on some of the failings of the Round Table, with which I agreed and elaborated on in my book.
What about Tragedy and Hope?
That was a rather peculiar book. Carol Quigley seemed to believe that the Round Table was part of some vast nexus of influence controlled by Lord Alfred Milner, which wielded enormous behind-the-scenes influence in British political life. It was really an argument for the conspiracy theory of history, which I find utterly ridiculous.
What was wrong with his arguments?
Well, for one thing, he didn't cite any sources for anything he said. This is quite strange for a scholar, especially when he writes a book that I presume he meant to be taken seriously.
You cited all your sources in the Round Table movement and Imperial Union?
Indeed I did.
In reading your book, I got the impression that it was written as a refutation of Professor Quigley, even though you don't actually refer to him until the very last paragraph of your book.
Yes, that's largely true.
If Quigley believed that the Round Table was part of a web of influence controlled by Milner, what was your counter-thesis?
Not only was the Round Table not controlled by Lord Milner, the actual scope of its influence was quite limited. By this, I mean its influence on the British Empire and its policies, including its transition into the Commonwealth. In terms of foreign policy, especially the question of appeasement in the 1930s, my assessment is somewhat different.
That is quite an unexpected position to take, given what contemporaries are recorded to have said about the Round Table.
Yes, it is at odds with what other people said at the time.
Before we get to that, please explain what made the Round Table movement different from other similar groups.
Perhaps the biggest difference was its geographical scope and its longevity. The closest parallel would probably be the Imperial Federation League, which was an empire-wide organization, but which collapsed in the 1880s. In the case of the Round Table, it had branches in all of the British dominions, including a short-lived branch in India, and it even had associates in the United States.
You would be referring to George Louis Beer of Columbia University.
Yes, and also men like Whitney Shepherd's son. I should point out, however, that the Round Table never established groups in the United States.
Didn't they consider creating a group in the United States?
That was briefly considered in 1916, when Lionel Curtis visited New York and met with Beer to discuss the possibility. However, they decided against it.
You mentioned Professor Burt as a Canadian member. How many Canadians joined the Round Table movement?
At its height, the Round Table had about 300 members in Canada.
What about other dominions?
I believe the numbers were fewer, but there was a fair number in Australia. Researcher Leonie Foster has written a book about the Australian Round Table that includes a complete list of its members, and there were quite a few. The weakest of the groups were in South Africa, since there was strong Dutch influence against the Round Table's pro-British sentiments.
How long did these groups last?
Quite a while in some cases. In Canada, the groups declined dramatically in the 1920s, but in Australia the groups lasted until the 1970s. In fact, recently the Round Table was revived in Australia, so it is a presence outside of Britain again.
Let's go back to the topic of Round Table influence, and get your reaction to a couple of examples of what contemporaries thought of it.
All right.
There was Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the former Prime Minister of Canada, who in 1917 wrote that he thought Canada was controlled by a cabal called the Round Table, which was based in London.
It helps to look at the historical context of who said this. Sir Wilfrid was from Quebec, and he was a leader of the Liberal Party, who resented what he saw as any attempt to reduce Canadian autonomy. He certainly knew of the Round Table and had a general idea of its objectives, which if carried out would indeed have lessened Canadian independence. But for the most part his statement was an overreaction brought on by having an excitable personality.
All right, how about this one? In October 1921, Lord Riddle recorded in his diary that British Prime Minister David Lloyd George told him that the Round Table was the most powerful group in the country. He also said that Lloyd George told him that the Round Table exercised much behind-the-scenes influence. Was Prime Minister Lloyd George another excitable individual?
In some ways he was, but we have to take into account several things. First, we have only Lord Riddle's word that Lloyd George said that to him. It's hearsay evidence.
Why would Lord Riddle want to make up something like that?
Who can say? Besides, even if he was accurate about what Lloyd George told him, the facts indicate that his statement was an exaggeration. It would be ridiculous to argue that the Round Table was the most powerful group in the country.
You make it very clear in your book that the Round Table had far less influence than was generally thought at the time. What puzzles me is your reasoning for why it lacked influence.
Oh?
Let's take the political situation when Lloyd George supposedly made his statement to Lord Riddle. A few months earlier, Lord Milner had been Colonial Secretary, and before that he was Secretary of State for War. Lloyd George's private secretary was former Round Table editor Philip Carr. Another Round Tabler, Waldorf Astor, had been a secretary. A former member, Leo Amery, had been associated with the cabinet. And then there were other Round Tablers who had done war service for the government.
Certainly there was a great deal of involvement by members of the Round Table movement in the running of the wartime and post-war Lloyd George government.
That isn't persuasive for you.
No, because you have to ask yourself, what were the objectives of the Round Table, and were those objectives pursued when Round Table members were in positions of power? If you look at the situation that way, it's clear the Round Table had very little influence.
Well, that brings us to the obvious question, what were the Round Table's objectives?
That is the key question. It is quite clear that the Round Table's primary objective was to lay the groundwork for the federation of the British Empire.
An imperial federation. What would this have meant for the British Empire? Wasn't it united already?
Of course it was already one empire, but imperial federation, or imperial union, was meant to solve a number of problems with the existing system of political organization.
What kind of problems?
In its structure, the British Empire had a great variety of forms. There were the self-governing dominions, which were independent in their internal affairs, but whose relations with foreign countries were controlled from London. There was the Indian Empire, which was a collection of princely states and regions ruled directly by Britain.